Welcome to the Great Basin Landscape Conservation Cooperative webinar series. I'm Todd Hopkins, the Science Coordinator for the Great Basin LCC. For those of you who may be new to the LCCs, we're a public-private partnership working to meet large-scale conservation challenges across the Great Basin. This series highlights a few of the projects that we've sponsored, and we hope these webinars can provide a platform for discussion about research and its application to the Great Basin. We're going to keep today's presentation relatively short, 30 to 40 minutes, and reserve the second half of the hour for questions and discussions with the presenter. Since there are a lot of folks on the webinar, we ask that you type in your questions as they arise. We'll read out your questions to the speaker at the end of the presentation. Today's webinar will be recorded and available on our website. And on your screen, you'll notice a small collapsed control panel in the upper right corner. By clicking on the small arrow button, you can expand the control panel. And in this expanded control panel, you can send in a question. Simply type your question into the chat area towards the bottom and press send. This question will be sent to us to respond to at the end of the webinar. I'd now like to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Samantha Chisholm Hatfield from Oregon State University. Dr. Hatfield, it's all yours.
Thank you. Chela, Dr. Samantha Chisholm Hatfield wa amnashi, shi tutut ne shi salagi. My name is Dr. Samantha Chisholm Hatfield. I'm from Oregon State. I want to thank Todd Hopkins and all of the Great Basin LCC for their wonderful support for funding this research project that we got to do. I'm going to show you a lot of pictures and have a discussion about what we did and how we did it, and I'm going to start that off by recognizing the Great Basin LCC for their wonderful support of TEK research. That's a phenomenal thing to have a support network that is so involved with natural resources and tribal communities that rely on those natural resources. I am from Oregon Climate Change Research Institute, which is housed within Oregon State University, and we do climate change work and research. I particularly focus on TEK, and I'm a TEK specialist. I also work in the areas of adaptation and looking at climate change adaptation measures that tribes are engaging in or have engaged or are in the process of moving through because of climate change effects on natural resources in their environment. So for those of you who don't know what TEK is, because there are a variety of people here, TEK is based in the environmental knowledge, a long term. There are different kinds of knowledges. Some are fisherman knowledge, some are farmers knowledge, there's local ecological knowledge, LEK. But TEK is very different because it's based through oral tradition and through long-term observation, meaning multiple generations. It isn't just going in and talking to somebody who's been there for, 20 or 30 years. We're talking at least 50 years of information that have been passed along. Some of these people have 4 and 5 generations worth of knowledge that back them up, that they rely on. And that's really important for tribal communities to have that base. That's what they operate from in many situations with their natural environments. That's how they evolved into the places that they are, or adapted when they were shifted into reservation systems or areas that they were given for reservations, to be able to survive and actively manage those systems. So it's really important that the understanding of that long-term understanding and knowledge is the basis of this. It isn't just going in and talking with somebody who has had several successive crops that they've grown, or somebody who's just been in the house a long time. It's really a very vetted process to go through. So what I did was I looked at Duckwater Shoshone tribe in Nevada and the Shivwits band in Utah, and I worked very closely with the tribal communities. I called the Cultural Resources Department and asked them for information of who would be good and who they would like to have, you know, interviewed that they thought was a really good representative group for their tribal entity. Every community has different TEKs, so every tribe that you go into is going to have different knowledges about specific things. They might be more hunters, they might be more root diggers, there might be more berry pickers, there might be more storytellers even. That each one of those gives you a really broad look, but within that grouping also gives you details of history and management and sustainability efforts. And so that's really important to understand, that it gives you, you need all of the components, not just one, to look at that adaptation measure and all of the things that had been going on and how climate change is affecting what they do now, or what they've done 10 years ago and has started and morphed into where it is now. So with that, I need to announce that with my information and my research, I never give out culturally sensitive information. As a Native researcher, I am enrolled with the Confederated Tribes of Siletz. I am able to go in and facilitate some of the understanding that many non-Native researchers miss cultural pieces of. And so that for me is a benefit, but it also can hinder some release of information. I'm given information that is sensitive many times, and so I never release that, and I always say that, you know, that intellectual property and those sensitive information pieces that are gifted to me are given back to the tribe and only to the tribe, and I don't keep those in any shape or form. And so I just want to be rest assured that that is not going to be part of it. Everything that has been released has been okayed by the tribe, and that's really important to acknowledge when you're doing TEK, because that can be a huge issue for Native peoples to be exploited, or for traditional areas to be exploited in a really dangerous fashion. So here is where we're at up here in the Ellie Shoshone Tribal Reservation. We're up here in this area. This is what we're talking about for the Shoshone, the Duckwater peoples. And then for the Shivwits, they are actually down here in the western area of Ivins, Utah, and they're very low. You can see they're almost at the border. And so the St. George area, all of that area, if you're aware of that. There are different bands of these tribes of the Shoshone and the Paiute, but I chose the Shivwits and the Duckwater for their activities and their cultural knowledge that they engage in. For the Shoshone, you can see it's very mountainous around them, and it was one of the hallmarks for the people. They talked about the mountains a lot. Most notably was the snow melting, and they had noted, I'd taken this picture on my way to the reservation, but when I got there, ironically, they mentioned, the interviewees mentioned that the snow was melting on top, and how that was shifting, and how it should have been, there should have been more that was still left. I went mid-June, in the middle of June, and I was surprised at how their perspective of what should have been on the mountain had changed drastically. one of the other things that they talked about was the amount of snowfall, either in, early spring, winter, and how it had decreased dramatically from years past, and lots of stories about how they dealt with the snow and what that meant. And one of the things that they had talked about were the creeks not getting enough water. Water was a big issue with both tribes, but because of the shift in the mountainous regions, the water places for the animals were drying up, and the animals were actually coming down further into the valley areas than they had before, and that was one of their recognitions of changes. So they have antelope that they have gathered, they have collected for many years, and one of the things that they've said were the antelope coming down further, and then seeing them on what they call the plains in the valley there. And I got to see these guys when I was driving back and forth. It was pretty unique, but they had talked about their shifting patterns and how these antelope groups don't stay in the same places anymore, and so hunting is then affected, their hunting patterns and their hunting times. Same thing with their wild horses. These are all my pictures and that I took on the reservations, so these are all in the setting at the same time that I was doing my research. You can see in the hills, in the mountainous areas there's no snow caps. There's no snow left at all, and that was one of the troubling issues. Likewise, for their streams, they talked about how their streams were changing. Warmer water was a real big hallmark. They have fished and traditionally gotten different fishes, primarily carp, in this stream, but they had noted several underground streams that had come up and were very, very cold but had turned warm. And I think there were 3 that they had noted that were now warm that had been cold for many, many years. They would talk about so-and-so's place, the stream near, so-and-so's house, or the stream at, and water was actively collected. They have running water now, but that was an activity that they used to do, was fish, and then they would eat the fish. That was a traditional food, and collect the water for different reasons. And so that was important to see. One of the things they also talked about with these streams is that there was a catfish factory that went in that many people worked at that was further upstream from where they are at, and they had practiced fishing and collected carp most of the time, but after this catfish factory came in, they noted that catfish started showing up in the streams and they were having trouble with it. And then they noted that the fish themselves were changing. They were diseased and they had found worms, and it was not good fishing. And I don't think I found anyone that actually fished as a food source anymore. And so that was something that was changed within about the last 50 years, which is, for TEK, that's a pretty short timeline. 50 years is a real good indicator that something has drastically changed. Very, very significantly for a community like that. And then they talked about not being able to get medicines and plants that usually grew down further. And then the plants that they got at the summits, like this current summit that they were talking about in one instance, have shifted areas. And that was referenced in tandem with the snow and the remaining snow that has disappeared. Areas are just too dry. Areas just don't have the ability to sustain anymore, and certain patches and natural resource surroundings affect where they can get their medicines and traditional plants and even some of the food sources that they get. So moving on to Shivwits, going on down, we're excuse me, now in Utah. And Shivwits is down in the southern part of Utah, down near the border. And they, too, talked about the housing that had changed. They have actually been moved because of a dam that was built there. And so their area that they were in had shifted just slightly, not by hundreds of miles, but to a close by region. Probably not very many. I wouldn't say it was significant, but it made a difference for them because of the river and how the river flows. So you can see one of the older homes that was traditional. And again, they talked about the mountains in the background that surround them. Both tribes talked about jackrabbits, but Shivwits talked, the interviewees talked really strongly about how jackrabbits were, and rabbits in general. There were 3 types of rabbits that they used to hunt and eat and use. And the bigger ones always have worms now, I was told. These were an important food source, and now they don't eat them. And people talk about how they're no good and how they were full of worms. And so that has shifted as well. And that wasn't clear why that happened, but it's definitely a big shift for them as well. Certain other things like rabbit blankets were a traditional item that were very commonly used, and that was a sense of loss. Rabbit blankets were acknowledged, and almost everyone said they don't do that anymore. And then the river was changed from the dam that was put in, and that was pretty unique. Food sources, medicines, fishing, again, impacted by how the river flows and then what is done. Lots of interviews with people who used to farm or used to have natural fruit trees on their place because of the river system that was established, and now where they're at, there aren't any. It's a pretty flat area, not heavily fortified with any trees or natural vegetation that they had collected previously. Even though it's not very far away, again, they're just west of Ivins, Utah. It's enough of a change to alter their lifestyle. There was a lot of natural gathering that occurred that I was told about, and that again shifted because of the lack of water, and then in recent years how climate change has impacted that drought situation. And then going up into the hills in the mountains nearby and collecting, again, medicines, roots, plants to eat and to use for various, either salves or for medicinal purposes that are external or internal, taken orally or just used externally. That's really changed. Things have dried up. The drought has impacted many of these people, and in their traditional ways, that trek up to the mountains and collecting those items was a normal process, but that has been altered significantly. And then one of the other things was a berry that comes off of a bush that they used to use readily for various things, like a tea, for use of constipation as a medicinal berry, just eating it, and those have shifted as well, that the use of that berry and the accessibility of the readiness of those berries, they're still found, but apparently not as abundantly as they used to be. And so that was another significant change for them, along with the other things. And then again, another shot of the landscape and what used to be traversed, and you can see the river is really not very wide. There were stories about people going down and enjoying the river and it being a community activity, and that was really important. Places that build community are really fortified within tribal communities, and that's a really strong attribute to keep those sustained and do those sustainability efforts for those natural resource areas. There's a reciprocity, there's a give and take with the land that Native communities hold very dear. That's really a tenet of keeping the land safe and strong, so you can be safe and strong, your community can be safe and strong. And when that's not possible because of an outside force, that really shakes the community and shakes an identity of a people. And so that's really important to recognize that, you know, if you can't do something like this, that's really difficult to handle for tribal communities. So one of the takeaways I want to emphasize is that time is cultural, and we saw this with the Pacific Northwest study as well, but environmental changes disrupt those sequences, the very basis of those sequences in those resources that have been available. If you went to the grocery store, if you relied on your backyard strawberry plant every year, and you knew it was going to be there, and it had been there for your parents, and it had been there for your grandparents, and you just knew that that was cultivated and taken care of, and then it was suddenly gone, or it just didn't bear any fruit, you would really have a struggle. And then that's just one plant. These tribes are relying on multiples, and that concept of time, when these plants and animals move, when they come out, when they bloom, that concept of time is challenged when those natural resources don't happen. And those natural resources are called markers. That timing is called, are called markers. So Native people really heavily rely on these natural resource markers. And so when those markers don't happen, that time is challenged. Things like carp and jackrabbit, all rabbits, the smaller rabbits as well. Water cycles was a really important thing. When it snowed, when it rains, how much it snows, wild celery, the berries, and then the shifting in the mountainous regions as well. How are the mountains doing, essentially? Land is looked at as a physical being almost. It's a living, breathing almost entity that is highly respected, and so working with that is important. And when plants die, or when, you know, there's trees that don't do as well, or if the drought comes in and it's killing an area where trees are and the deer like that or the elk like that, and then that's shifting just like you saw with the antelope, that really impacts the people for when they go and when they can hunt or collect. One of the things that we've also found were the seasons are shifting as well. We saw that up here in the Pacific Northwest, but very dramatically in the Great Basin area as well. The people rely on those markers not only from the plants but from the animals and their migration patterns back and forth into certain areas. And when those areas are affected, those animals shift and they don't come down, or they come down more often. In Duckwater Shoshone, they were talking about the deer and the antelope and the horses coming down and actually coming through some of the grouse coming and where they would move and how they couldn't get them in the traditional areas that they used to get them. And all of those food sources and those markers are really important, not only as a food source, but as a marker of when things are supposed to happen. And part of that TEK is the reciprocity, but also the timing. This is when we do this because, either this buds out, or, these are growing and they're ready, or a certain berry changes color. Those markers are really relied upon heavily, more than Fish and Wildlife releasing license tag season timings. The season of natural environmental cues has been a hallmark of TEK. So that's something that we look at very strongly when we go in and do these kinds of research projects. It's really important to say that foods are an important driver. So when I talk about foods, it's not just because I enjoy food or tribal communities enjoy food, but they're a source of identity. And when you didn't have the grocery stores and these tribal communities didn't have the monetary resources that other communities did, the foods were their identity, and that was also a source of community and going out and collecting in groups, hunting groups, fishing parties, root digging groups, any of that. That was a source of community, and that's really important. And so food is a really hallmark to look at as well. What's going on? What are they eating now? What did they eat? What can they collect now? What can't they get? Those things are really important to ask because that will give you a sense of what's going on. Food is a source of identity both culturally and personally. So certain families will have certain foods that they eat, and then foods are also on the flip side a marker. Just like I said, when it's collected, when it's moved, when it buds out, when it blossoms, that sort of thing. So we talked about Indian time, and Indian time we found it to be real in the Great Basin area as well. It follows the environmental patterns. It's very holistic. It's based in the natural resources and the events, meaning those markers and those, timings that happen. You're not going to have a berry bush that blooms or hopefully you won't, in wintertime. You're going to have less snow in the summer, but how much snow, that all fits into that timeline. Indian time is 3D rather than linear, and that means that in the Western mainstream system, we look on a timeline. We look on our calendars, we look on our phones, we look, on our planners, and in Native communities, they're looking out, they're looking around them. What is that bush doing? What is, that bird? Should it be here? That bird usually comes. I heard a story in Duckwater where one of the interviewees told me there was a group of birds that came for 2 weeks and then they left, and that timing had shifted, and she was very thrown by that because that timing sequence was much later than it should have been. And then Indian time is evolved and complicated based in natural laws. Just like I said, it shifts and morphs and ebbs and flows, but overall, in the general holistic sense of putting all of those generations together, what's it doing? What's the land doing? Is it adjusting for, a one-time event like an earthquake or a drought that happened one year, or is it ongoing, and is it shifting? And that's what we are seeing, that those natural laws of the ongoing continuous droughts and the ongoing continuous shifts of natural resources is affecting that Indian time. So we found the changes in seasonality. It disturbs the sense of natural time, of knowing, the sun is going to rise around 5 a.m., it's going to set around 9:30 at night, and then when it gets winter time, it changes. You have that general sense. Native communities also have that sense for other things as well. This is the time the fish should run. This is the time when we should be going and getting, this bird or that animal. And then that sense of wisdom is passed down through generations. And multiple times, I can't even tell you how many times, I have heard from Native people, my grandpa said, or my great-grandpa said, or my grandma said, or my grandma knows, or my grandma and I, and that TEK is really embedded in both communities and families. And people make decisions based on that long-term information. It's like an encyclopedia, it's a Google for all of these communities. And that's not being able to relied upon as heavily anymore. And then adaptations are being employed in various degrees. So some people will change some things. They might supplement some foods. They might trade for some foods with neighboring tribes. If there's a fishing family that used to hunt and fish, they might only fish and get other foods. I heard multiple instances of specifics where their adaptations are shifting a little bit and they're trying to find steady footing for where to go from here. If this isn't changing, how do we do this kind of thinking? And it is difficult when you rely on the land and you rely on those natural laws, that environmental law that happens in just naturally. There is no guidebook. It doesn't work to guess most of the time, and the laws that are overlaid for collection often are found to be not coinciding with what the seasons are actually doing. There was a lot of frustration about being able to go hunt and fish and collect excuse me, during times where nothing was blooming, or when they were saying that it was the wrong season, that the animals weren't in the right time. They were either birthing, or they were late, or they hadn't come down, or they had come down already and they were gone. A lot of frustration with where they were at and how those shifts have happened. So I'd like to close by thank you for being here and sharing my time, and I really want to thank the Great Basin LCC for providing this opportunity and providing research funding for TEK measures for tribal people, because this is really important stuff that gives you a breadth of knowledge that doesn't come out in mainstream Western scientific manners always. So this is really important. So I really want to thank you and thank everyone for being here.
Well, thank you, Dr. Hatfield. I think we'll see if we have some questions from the audience.
So Todd, no one has typed in a question quite yet, but I'll just remind folks that you can open up that control panel using that red arrow on your screen, and there will be a chat box where you can type in questions. And so please send in any questions this way, and we'll pass those on to Samantha.
So I have a question if we're waiting on folks to type in. Dr. Hatfield, it seems to me it would be real challenging to do something on a large landscape scale like some of the sage-grouse work with the pinyon and juniper removal and other kinds of fire breaks and things like that without disrupting natural cycles and affecting Native Americans. Do you have any guidance for resource managers on how to approach something like this? It seems pretty complicated.
Yeah, it is. You're right. And that's one of the things that tribes are looking at, how to do this in a way that's the least restrictive or the least impactful for communities and for areas. Like I said, many tribes, many Native people look at the land and the resources as living beings just on an equal footing. And so going in and disrupting a whole grouping of, you know, like trees, like you say, or the grouse, then has an impact not only culturally but also physically. And that's one of the things that tribes look at in a way that resource managers in Western scientific, non-Indigenous areas don't really have to focus on. They look at other impacts. And sometimes there are spiritual components to that have to be taken into account. Are there spiritual sacred areas? Are there, you know, I know that one of the issues that came up for the Shoshone were burial areas that had not been acknowledged by outsiders. And so that had to be taken into account within the tribe, and tribal people knew, but outside people didn't have any idea. And so, and that's not a sacred release of information. That was just a general, and so that's an example too of how there are multiple levels that have to be addressed. I would advise working closely with building a relationship with a tribal community, natural resources, and or cultural resources department within whatever tribe you're in tandem with locally, because that really is important. They're going to have some information for you that you probably won't get outside of, you know, the documents that you already have or the databases that you already have. There's going to be extraneous information that probably would never have come into play for your program. So that's really important to do. And tribes are really willing to work with people. All over the place I find, you know, we wish we could work more closely. We don't have an opportunity, or we don't know who to contact. It are common comments that I hear. So.
Thank you.
Great. We have a couple questions that have come in through the chat box. So the first one here for you, Dr. Hatfield, is this question: are there any visual references of the 3D concept of time for Native people? Do they try to represent time with drawings or patterns or anything like that?
Yes, somewhat. A lot of the depictions that you see have references embedded in them. Sometimes, because of the cultural sensitivities, meanings aren't always expressed. And I'm not sure how I can say it without releasing sensitive information. Shannon McNeely has a fabulous wheel of seasons that she has had drawn and has out there, and I don't have the citation for it. I should get that. But if you look up Shannon McNeely and season wheel is, I think, what she titled it, or something similar to that. If you Google that, I'm sure you can see. She has a visual. She's put it in a circle, and circles, for those of you who aren't aware, are the representation of a timeline for us in you know, an abstract sense, obviously. But when things happen and how they happen, we think in circular methodologies, and so she applied that to her Alaskan work, I believe, and showed when things were collected and when things came out and that sort of thing. So that I know of that, but each tribe has a different, you know, like basketry. I know for Shivwits I was told about the drawings, but I can't really release that information. So I would look at each tribe, whatever you're interested in, and see what they have available culturally. See what visual representations are available, and then speak with somebody if they're willing to speak with you about what is releasable, I guess is a good way to put it, for their respective tribe.
Thank you. The next question that's come in here is about the kind of next steps of your research. So the participant is wondering what the next steps are and if there are plans to develop adaptation plans in response to some of these observed changes.
Yes, that would be fabulous. Some of the tribes, like in Montana, the Salish Kootenai, or the Kootenai tribes, have done adaptation plans developed through their tribal organizations, measures for climate change adaptation, and looking at that. And I would like to be involved with more of that. We are looking at some adaptation plans here in the Northwest, and I know that I've spoken with my own tribe, but nothing, how can I say this? Nothing is firmed up yet as far as final as you know, as far as the finances and that sort of thing. It takes quite a bit of work to get a tribal project, a tribal research project or an adaptation plan funded. There are multiple levels. It's not as easy as just a general research project. You need to go through the IRB process, and then you have to go through tribal processes of tribal councils and subcommittees, and then their own tribal equivalent of IRB. And so that takes some time, and it's just a process, and it seems much slower, but it's just more involved. And so I'm going through some of those processes right now, and I'm hoping to do more studies. I would love to do more studies and get a better view of what's going on and dive into some areas more in depth. Spending 1 or 2 days with a community isn't really long enough. I'd rather spend, you know, 4 or 5 and really dig into a lot of the depth of what those elders have to say, and put out a really comprehensive book or report. But again, that harks back to funding, and we all want funding.
Liz, I'd like to jump in here for a minute, and Dr. Hatfield, I'm not sure if you're aware, but the Great Basin LCC has just funded Dr. Meade Crosby at the University of Washington to work with a group, climate scientists, and with a tribal advisory panel that has not been set up yet. So we're looking for members for a tribal advisory panel. And this group will be facilitating the creation of tools and assessments, vulnerability assessments for tribes to use in their climate adaptation planning. So we're trying to help that next step along. So folks, if you're interested in that, we'll have the last slide, we'll have my contact information, Todd Hopkins, Great Basin LCC. We'd love to have your participation in this effort.
This is Rick Carney. I need to point out that this is something we're doing in partnership with the Northwest Climate Science Center. And jointly, the climate groups are eager to help.
Very much so. Yes, we should talk afterward.
Yeah.
Well, I'd just like to say I'd really enjoy working with tribes, and I would encourage those of you who might be tribal on here to get involved and really make an impact. We like to see more, we'd like to see more, and we, being universities and researchers, like to have Native voices speak up. It's really difficult to get a group of Native people that are big enough, because there's a small group of us that, you know, everybody hears about us over and over and over, but we like to drag in others and say, really, you know, help us out here, because this is important stuff, and we are the people, Natives are the people that are impacted the most by climate change, and we're closest to the land. And so when we get in there and help other organizations, it's a cooperative effort. It really is needed. So that's wonderful to hear that that's taking place. I hadn't heard that yet.
Well, thank you, Dr. Hatfield. Liz, are we done with questions?
We got one second question related to adaptation, and I think most of this was probably covered already in the response, but it was just a kind of follow-up if there were other tribes that you have had experience with or researched with that had a lot of adaptive capacity, especially as it relates to TEK?
Yes, I'm here in the Northwest, Pacific Northwest. I've done work with the Siletz, the Quinault, Quileute, Ho tribe, Salish Kootenai, a little bit of collaboration, mostly advisement and conversation with Nez Perce. Let's see, what else? Oh, I can't think right now, but I have been primarily focused here in the Northwest. I have done some work, some discussion and advisement with the Navajo, not in great detail, but I'm very interested in TEK in various areas, and I'm willing to go do outside of the Pacific Northwest. Like Great Basin was fantastic to work with. These tribes were phenomenal in identifying what they needed and how it was adjusting. The forecast is not clear. What they need for the future, what they need now is pretty clear. You know, we don't get this, we can't get this, but the future is difficult, and you know, that's, every tribe is different, like I say. But my work is online. It's Googleable, if that's a word. And you're also welcome to look at the LCC and the OCRI.net places for the citations for my works too. We should have an article coming out here pretty soon. I don't think I have a date, but it's coming. So you can watch for that as well.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hatfield, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. A recording of the presentation will be available on our website probably early next week. If you have any questions about the LCC or this research, please feel free to contact myself or Dr. Hatfield. Our information's on the screen. And last but not least, we want to know what you thought of today's webinar. Please take our short 2-minute survey that will pop up on your screen as you log off. Your feedback is very valuable and helps us plan and improve future webinars. Thank you very much.